The Arab League has announced it's reached a deal with Syria on easing the country's long-running political crisis. The agreement urges Damascus to immediately withdraw security forces from the streets, release jailed demonstrators and start dialogue with the opposition. Syria has also agreed to allow rights groups and Arab League watchdogs into its country. But the US, meantime, still says it wants to see President Assad step down. For more on this, we're now joined by independent journalist James Corbett in Japan, who's been closely covering the story. Good to see you. So President Assad appears to have agreed to all of the Arab League's demands, but still Western countries are putting the pressure on. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is a coordinated agenda. It's really just the unfolding of a template that we've seen used a number of times in the past, including the quite recent past, which is to use humanitarian rights groups as sort of a front or a cover for destabilizing a regime. And we saw that quite literally happening with Libya. For people who were following what happened there, the UN Human Rights Council in January of 2011 was praising Libya for its stance on human rights. And in February, a group of 70 NGOs got together to file a letter basically protesting what Gaddafi's government, and within a few days the UN Human Rights Council convened a special session in which they condemned Libya. And I think we see a similar pattern happening here, where these human rights groups are being used as a way of funneling stories to the media that there's no way to attribute them, there's no way to verify them, there's no way to know whether or not these events are really happening at all. And the latest example, in fact, it's just breaking now, is that apparently they're trying to say that the ceasefire has already been broken by Syrian troops firing on citizens.
Indeed. We are already hearing that. It is interesting how you do draw the comparison between Libya and Syria, and you raise the issue of these human rights groups and these so-called human rights campaigns. And are any of these reports that come out actually legitimate? Of course, as we know, the whole UN resolution 1973 on Libya was all about protecting civilians, and we all saw how far that went. Now, some other countries in the region might be quite happy to see the regime change in Syria. We're talking regional powers here. If indeed they are eager for Assad to be removed, what would be the grander plan in all this, do you think?
Well, I think we see probably a similar thing playing out here as we did in Libya, which was to really take over the resources of the country. But more than that, I think with Syria, what we're looking at is a strategic area, which is a perfect place for launching a further assault into Iran. I think if the end game of this is Iran, then Syria is the stepping stone towards that, which is what I think we have to keep our eye on in all of this. But on the point of the humanitarian rights groups, we have a London-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is claiming the ceasefire has been broken. And this was the same group that back in August seems to have started spreading a story about incubator babies in Syria being harmed when electricity was cut off in the city of Hama. And again, we see that has direct parallels to the Iraq War back in 1991 with the incubator baby story that turned out to be delivered by the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, although no one knew that at the time. And that was one of the key events ramping up the American intervention in Iraq in 1991. And now we see this story, which turned out not to have any basis. It was again unattributed, and there were pictures circulated that turned out to be taken in Egypt, of all places, had nothing to do with Syria. So we see these types of organizations again and again coming up with these allegations, and it seems to me that this is heading towards a type of setup for a wide-scale intervention that the public otherwise wouldn't have any reason for being behind.
We had a story just a couple of months ago from the region where a lady, according to human rights groups, had been taken by security forces and then decapitated. And then a week later she suddenly appeared on media saying, well, this is all untrue. Here I am, and my head's perfectly intact. Now, the Syrian president has agreed to move government troops from the streets. But as we know, many of the protesters are quite well armed. How do you think the authorities are supposed to prevent the violence without further violence?
Well, that's a particularly good question, and I wish it was one that more media was asking, because one of the untold assumptions in all of this is that the protesters are somehow peacefully protesting and that there is no violence coming from their side of it, which I think is categorically untrue and has been shown to be untrue by the fact that Syrian forces themselves are being shot at. So clearly there are armed protesters here. This is not, and again, like in Libya, where we saw the well-funded and well-supported rebels taking over in Libya, well, we see that happening again through covert means here, with covert supplies going to the Syrian opposition. And that came out earlier this year, that in fact the U.S. State Department has been funding the Syrian opposition for years. So again, we see the exact same pattern ramping up, and again on the case of building up stories that just were completely untrue. We saw again in Libya with the story of Gaddafi's forces having their Viagra-fueled rape sessions, which again turned out to be another completely contrived story with no basis, and the ICC eventually had to drop that from their request for an arrest warrant. So again, we see that, and unfortunately now we see this straying into the nuclear field, with the latest being that supposedly connections have been turned up between Syria and the AQCON nuclear network, which we all know was supported and funded and protected by the CIA from the 1970s onward, and that comes straight from the Dutch economic foreign minister Ruud Lubbers.
We're also hearing at the same time that this alleged nuclear facility in northern Syria for the past 2 decades has been used as a cotton mill. James Corbett, I wish we had more time, editor of the independent news website CorbettReport.com. Thank you.
Thank you.